Hello everyone, in this tutorial we are going to talk about blocks in Spock. So in general, Spock has provided a very good interface to implement all the conceptual phases of any of the feature method. And these implementations are done in a very structural way with the help of blocks. So in general, there are 6 blocks available like when, then, setup, expect, where, and cleanup. So let's talk more about feature method and blocks. So any of the feature method can't be called feature method if it is not going to have at least one explicit blocks, either it is when, then, combination, or where, expect, cleanup, or setup. It means if we are just going to create any feature method without these blocks and trying to execute that code, then it will never be initialized. So let's see the example first. So here in Eclipse, create one Groovy class, fourth example, and extend it with a specification class. Now inside this, create one feature method and give its name feature method without explicit block. Suppose we are just trying to print one statement. Here we are in feature method. Save it and run it. Run as JUnit. Here we can see that nothing is happening. And if we are just going to the console, then we can see that execution has been stopped. It means a feature method can't be executed or any specification class with any of the feature method that is not going to have any block is not going to be initialized. So for that, at least one explicit block is needed. So for time being, if we are just going to use setup block and going to save it and going to run it as a JUnit test, then we will see that it had just executed the feature method, and here on console we can see that here we are in feature method. It means at least one block is needed inside feature method. So let's talk about setup block. So in general, setup block is used to set up all the initialization, or in general we say like any kind of variable definition, object definition, or any kind of initial precondition will be kept inside this setup block. But at the same time, this is not mandatory to have setup block. We can just omit it, or we can use the initialization inside other blocks as well. But in general, we should keep initialization in setup. And since we have just discussed that given is also a alias of setup, so in place of setup we can just use given block as well. And setup and given block will always be used single time inside any of the feature method. If we are just trying to use more than one setup block inside feature method, then this is going to show some sort of error. So let's see, suppose we are just going to add two setup method, going to save it, and already showing one compilation error. Here it is saying setup is not allowed here. Instead, use one of the expect, when, cleanup, where, or end of method in place of setup. It means whenever we are just going to use two setup blocks inside a single feature method, then this is going to show some sort of compilation error. So let's remove it, and in place of this, if we are just going to use expect and we are going to keep this statement, that is println here, and going to save it and going to run it, then we'll see that both statements are being printed on the screen. So it means setup block will always be used only one time inside a feature method, and it is normally used to define any of the variable. So let's define def a equal to 5, def b equal to 6, and at the same time we are just going to define one object of sum of two number class that we have previously seen. So here we have initialized all the object or variable those are needed inside this feature. And here we are moving in other blocks, when and then block. And always remember that when and then block will comes together. If we are using when, then will be needed. And if we are not going to use then block, then it is going to show some sort of compilation error. And in general, when block is going to have some sort of arbitrary code, or we will say that some action related code will be kept inside when, while in then block it is going to be either conditional sentence or exception condition, or it is going to have interactions, and we can also have variable definition inside the then block. And here the conditional statements are purely the boolean expression. So either we can just compare two number, we can check whether some number is greater or less than from the right or left hand side. So let's see one example where we are just going to use when and then block. So here, if we are going to take one def sum equal to, we are just performing one action and we are pushing the return value into a sum variable. So here we are just going to call obj dot adder and going to pass a comma b. When we are just performing this action, then in then block we have to define one boolean expression. So we are just going to compare this sum with the actual value, like 5 and 6 are going to be 11, so we are just going to match it with 11. So this is one example where we are just going to use setup, when and then. Save it and run it as a JUnit test. And here we can see that test is passed. Let's take another when and then block where we are just going to create one list and we are going to add some value inside it, like 3 comma list dot add 4. And here we have created one list, we are just using one random code inside this, but we haven't used then block. And here we can see that it is saying that and or then are expected. If we are just hovering on this error message, then it is saying and then block is expected. So let's add then block here. So we have added two numbers, so we can just perform one conditional statement, save it and run it. So here we can see that test has been passed. Now we are just going to talk about exceptional condition within then block. So for that, let's add one more when and then block, and inside when block we are going to define one list and going to add two value, list dot add 4. And let's add one print statement, println, and where we are just going to figure out one value that is not inside this list. Here we can see that size of list is 2, but now we are just going to ask some value beyond this 2 value. So let's do that, list dot get, and inside this pass any random value that is greater than 2. So here I am just taking 5, and we know that this is beyond the size of list, and once we will ask about any value that is beyond the size of list, it will throw index out of bound exception. So we know that if we are just going to perform list dot get 5, then it is going to throw exception. So that can be handled like this, then block, and inside this we are just going to write thrown, and inside this thrown method index out of bound exception. So it will be thrown by then block, and after this we are just going to write one statement. Finally we have thrown the exception, and if we want, then we can do some conditional statement again here, like list dot size equal to. So let's save this and run this. Here we can see that complete execution has been passed. So we have just seen setup, when then block. Now let's jump to the expect block. So it is quite similar to then block, but it normally have natural stimulus, means some action, and at the same time some conditional statement is associated. So suppose we are just talking about the math class, and inside this we know that there are number of methods through which we normally get some sort of return, and that can be compared with certain expected result. So now let's see one example. So inside this feature method, I'm going to add expect block, and inside this block we are going to call, let's take max method. Suppose we are taking 2 comma 3, and we know that 3 is the max value, so let's compare it with 3. Save it and run it. So here we can see that test passed. So in this section we have talked about setup, when then block, expect block, and the final block is cleanup block. So suppose we have just created any object, those are we need to release that resource. In that case we can just use clean up and we can just give the cleanup statement, but for time being I'm using one println statement. Run it as a JUnit test. Here we can see that this specification class is passing successfully. So that's all. In coming lecture we will see about where block, because where block is quite broad, and inside where block we can just try to see some data driven approach as well. So thanks for watching.